we left off having talked about, where are you? The basic architecture a little bit, and as a couple people mentioned, the architecture will start to become a little bit more clear with the steps we start taking in terms of design. In fact, this next section on administration, I think will actually really help put things in context, because in order to set up our project, we're going to need to work into the different layers of the system to configure our project, to get things up and running. So to a degree, this should give us a bit of context to some of that discussion that we had previously. And it won't take too long. And again, at the end of this, we get to start putting our hands to the system and building our projects out and getting ready for the work we're going to do. So in terms of administration, there are a few different tiers. And that's why I was saying it was such a good analogy that John made about the three-tier model, because you do start to see that. You see that there is a tier of administration wherein we do have to work against that WebSphere level. What's interesting, I was thinking about it over lunch, is that if you were the server admin, and that's not our goal here, to be clear, there are other classes for folks who are going to be the InfoSphere server administrators, but I bring it up only because if you were the InfoSphere server admin, that model would be 100% spot on, because you have to start with logging into WebSphere as a WebSphere admin, configuring WebSphere correctly. Then we configure the DataStage engine. Then we configure the database layer. So just like that traditional three-tier server architecture, somebody does have to build and maintain that in order for us to use DataStage. That's why it was such a perfect analogy. For us as developers, we see that reflected in what has to be done in order for us to build our jobs. And so in this lecture, what we're going to look at is what it takes to configure your project at each of those layers. So we start with the web console. And through the InfoSphere web console, we will configure the needed components of the WebSphere layer. Once we get those pieces configured, the next step would be to log into the DataStage side to configure the DataStage engine and then the DataStage project. And then finally, in the next section, we're going to start populating XMeta with metadata. So you actually do see those three tiers, each one being applied as the logical steps for us to get a new project off the ground. So first and foremost, we have again, let's just quickly put it up on the board. I know you're probably getting sick of seeing the diagram, but just to give us context, that way I can keep pointing back to it. I want to just have it up here because I want to make sure we're clear about which piece we're configuring with which tool. So the basic working concept here is that we have a brand new server just installed with InfoSphere. We've got the WebSphere backbone. We have, let's assume everything on one box. They installed DB2 as part of the install. And so DB2 is going to serve as our metadata repository. And we've got our DataStage engine. And we're going to start configuring the bits and pieces necessary to start working on our project. Now for our labs, just so we can draw a direct parallel, the server is called Ed Server. So let me go ahead and put a name up here on this machine. This machine is Ed Server. That way, when you see references to Ed Server in the diagrams and documents here, you know we're talking about this guy. Okay, the web console is going to allow me to talk to this machine. So I'll come in over the web here, over HTTPS, and I'm going to start configuring the domain, the sessions, the user accounts, really anything that supersedes any particular DataStage, or I'm sorry, InfoSphere product. So we talked a little bit earlier about how there's products besides DataStage, Information Analyzer, Fast Track, DataClick. The things you configure through the web console are those global settings. And that should make sense because we're talking to that backbone server. So the only settings we can deal with at this level are those settings that really are universal to all the tools. Things like your user account, things like the logging, things like how long before a session timeout, things of that nature. So I'm going to take you through the steps that they're listing out here, one by one, starting with the login. If you look really closely at this slide, you can see that there's two tabs open here. That's because if you remember what I mentioned earlier, they don't ask anymore that we memorize URLs. This URL, IBM IIS console login, was the one we used to have to memorize all the time. So we used to type https:// server name 9443 IBM IIS login console, console login. These days, you don't bother with that. You just remember Launchpad. The Launchpad page, remember I was saying earlier, has shortcuts to all of the necessary thin client tools. So you memorize the URL for Launchpad and it'll take you everywhere else. That's why they have two tabs there. Someone opened up the Launchpad, and then from Launchpad, they went to the admin console login. So we log in. For what it's worth, they're using the account ISAdmin. That's a default account. So if you ever set up a brand new install, ISAdmin is the default InfoSphere admin account. Upon login, there's a couple different things we can do. One of the primary reasons that I would log in the real world on that console, IS web, admin web. One of the primary reasons why I would log in on that console is to set up accounts. A lot of times I'm going in there for account management. And so I can go in there and set up users and groups. And when I do so, there are two tiers of access. There is what are you to InfoSphere as a whole? And then for us, what are we to DataStage? InfoSphere doesn't really care if you're a DataStage developer or someone who just runs jobs or you're a production manager. And we'll talk more about those roles, obviously, in a few moments. But InfoSphere simply says, I need to know if you're a user or an admin. So at the InfoSphere level, it says, listen, it's not my responsibility for day-to-day control project by project. InfoSphere just wants to know who are the admins and who aren't the admins. That's what they're mentioning here. DataStage roles, administrator or a user. That's it. Now, of course, there's more granular control. It's just that it doesn't come from the InfoSphere level. I'll show you exactly what I mean by that in a moment. So here we are inside the InfoSphere web console. We've gone to the administration tab and we're setting up users and groups. Under users on the far right, there is a new user option. When you open that up, it asks you for pretty much what you'd expect. The mandatory fields are going to be a username, first and last name, password, and confirm password. And then they have other profile pieces we could put in there. You could put in a title, phone numbers. There's a lot of field data. It's up to us which fields we choose to apply after those four mandatory fields, username, password, first and last. But if you look to just the right of that, so we see, here's the profile info. And just to the right of that are the InfoSphere suite roles and the component roles. So for InfoSphere, I could be an admin or a user. And then for the different components like DataStage, I can be an admin or a user. For what it's worth, you might have noticed that at the suite level, they have common metadata admin, common metadata importer, and common metadata user. And then they have suite admin, suite user. It's far outside the scope of this class. I shouldn't say far, because it's possible that any one of you could end up being an InfoSphere admin at some point. It's outside the scope of this class. However, just to mention it, because we do see it on this screenshot here, InfoSphere has a few accounts that are charged specifically with dealing with this guy. That metadata repository, as you could probably guess, is very important to us. That's where all of our shared metadata lives. It's where your actual project data lives. So earlier I said, what if John imported the sales table for me, or for his project, and then I borrowed it? He would be importing metadata that's going to be shared. And so they eventually, over the years, evolved a specialized set of roles geared towards that specific concept. The idea that if we have a production server out there, here's my production database server, and on that server, I have a database. And this time it's the sales schema. So let's go back to that scenario from earlier where John imported one table. Now John is the DBA. And as the DBA, I'm the ETL developer. John's responsible for all of our data structure. Better yet, he's the data architect. He's not going to be working in DataStage every day, but he's the one who knows if the database structures are consistent, if they're accurate. He's responsible for making sure that the information I have is correct and up to date. So we need to get him access to this repository in such a way that he can get the data, the schema, from here and bring it into the metadata repository. So InfoSphere recognizes that role. It says in that scenario, John would be a metadata, probably administrator would be the best one to use. I make John the common metadata administrator, and what it gives him the ability to do is to take all the tables from here that he thinks I'm going to need to develop my ETL jobs, and he can import their schema, or rather, I'm sorry, their DDL into the metadata repository for me. That's the idea behind a common metadata admin or importer. The difference being an importer can only import, an admin could import and then go log in and make changes later. Sometimes the reason I changed my original assessment to make John a data architect is because if he were just a DBA, we might say as a database admin, I'm not going to give you access to change what's in here, but I might make you a common metadata user. So the DBA could go browse what's out there and say, hey, you guys need to get on the same page, or you're out of date or something like that. So that's why they have those three special roles: a metadata admin, metadata import, or metadata user. They're all specifically geared towards that repository. Like I said, it's not something that really concerns us as ETL developers. It's just, since you saw it on the screen there, I thought it was worth giving you a little bit of context for that. The ones we're more concerned with are the components. Most DataStage users, be they admins or DataStage developers, will be an InfoSphere suite user and then a DataStage admin or user. So in this example, they're creating an account. Let's say it's the Jason account. I've been picking on him all morning. Let's use John one more time. So I take the John account, and he's going to be our DataStage admin. So to InfoSphere as a whole, we make him a suite user. But if you look at the very bottom there, it says DataStage and Quality Stage Administrator. All of those different components we talked about earlier, the governance catalog, the information analyzer, DataStage, what else? Oh gosh, DataClick, services director. All of those different components are on that list of components. And so you notice they're checkboxes because you could be more than one. He might be the DataStage admin, the IA admin, and the IGC admin. So there's a lot of different roles there that we can assign. And so for DataStage, we made John an admin. What that means is the minute you make someone a DataStage admin here, they immediately have access to every DataStage project. And that's important because, let me skip a little bit ahead because I want to make this a complete thought here. Someone here who's identified as a DataStage admin is immediately added to every existing DataStage project now or in the future. So if we had a brand new site or a brand new setup, and we make John the DS admin, and then you create a JSON account. We create a JSON account. I'm also an InfoSphere Suite user, but I'm a DataStage and Quality Stage user. What that means is that if there's a project already out there called DS Project, when we go into the DataStage Administrator, here's the DataStage Administration console, and log in. Right now, if we're the only two accounts, John's the only one who can do anything because I'm not tied to any project yet. Your average run-of-the-mill DataStage developer must be granted access to a project before he can do something or she can do something, whereas an admin is immediately granted access to every project. So by making John an admin, he can log in and select DS Project. And if he opens up DS Project's permissions page, this is what it's going to look like at the moment. Right now, this is a project that was just created, and it says DS admin, IS admin, student, WS, WAS admin, and John are all assigned to this project. Why? Because of their role, DataStage and Quality Stage Administrator. If I'm supposed to be the developer working on this project, John as the admin can then add me to the project. He clicks the button, add user or group. It'll show him a list of every DataStage account that's not added to that project. So it's here that he would be able to select the JSON account, add me to the project, and then assign me a level of access. What am I to that project? So in addition to the roles that we see for InfoSphere, which is the suite user for both of us, and the role that we assign to the DataStage component, John is an admin, I'm a user. For a user, some admin will have to give them access to the project and a specific level of access. And the choices at DataStage level are you could make me an operator, a super operator, you could make me a developer, or a production manager. What are the differences? An operator can just execute jobs. That's it. Usually I reserve operator for automated accounts. You could write a script to run your jobs. And if you did so, if I wrote a script and said every night at midnight this script executes a batch job, I would probably create an account of type operator. That way, if anyone got a hold of that account, they couldn't really do much with it other than run jobs. An operator can't even open up the DataStage designer. But a super operator can open up the DataStage designer in read-only mode. So the difference is a super operator can say, all right, I want to go in there and see all the jobs so I can pick the one I want. They can't edit anything, but they can open up and see the job designs. The developer is the most common. Most of us would probably end up being developers. John's the admin, I'm designing the jobs. He makes me a developer so I can go in and start writing jobs. A developer can write, compile, edit, test, really do just about anything they want, with one exception. Hence the need for production manager, because there's an exception. The one exception, the one thing a developer cannot do is import into a protected project. which probably sounds awfully odd or oddly specific, and it is. Let me try to explain where that methodology comes into play, because there's a very specific reason why they built them that way. I mentioned earlier that many sites are going to have more than one install. But it could also be carried out that you just have one server and 2 projects. The point is that it's entirely plausible that in your environment you have a dev and prod. So let's say that this is our environment. And let's go a little bit further. Let's say that John's the admin, Jason is a developer, but Nithya is a production manager. So she's that highest role, that 4th role within DataStage. What that means is that when we're developing our project, so we develop a project called DS Project. Underneath DS Project, there's a job that we build called File to DB. So as a developer, I'm working on that job. And I get the job to a point where it looks good. In fact, the whole project is at a point where John says, you know, we're ready as an admin. He says, we're ready to move this from dev to prod. The project looks good. It looks like we're ready to go. Let's go ahead and deploy that to production. The way that we deploy a project in DataStage is typically that you export it to a DSX file. We're going to talk more about those a little later on today. So we export our project into a DSX file. Then we import that into production. And typically what we'll do is once we've migrated it over to production, we will mark that project as protected. A protected project, think of it like a locked project. So now we have a copy of DS Project running in production, and John, as the admin, goes in and locks it. That's best I could do. That's supposed to be a lock icon. So it's a protected project. A protected project means no one can directly edit it. So what happens next? The JSON account, as a developer, I go in and I realize, you know, we need to make a few changes. There's some bugs in that file to DB job. So I update it. Let's call the new copy file to DB prime. Once that's done, I've updated that job, I export it. So we create an export, a new DSX. And in that DSX would be the change to file to DB, as well as any new jobs that we've written in the interim. As a developer, the one difference between a developer and a production manager is that a developer cannot import into a protected project. And now it probably makes a lot more sense why. Because the role of a production manager, in addition to everything a developer can do, a production manager could come in and take this DSX and import it into the protected project, even if that import results in some overwrites. So the whole idea behind this is that once a project is moved to production, we lock it up so that no one directly edits it. A lot of times we do that even just for protect us from ourselves. That way I don't connect accidentally to the wrong one and start editing. So we make sure nobody's going to edit that. However, Nithya, as the production manager, has the ability to import the newest update when it's ready, when she deems it ready. Whereas myself, as the developer, I can just keep working away on the copy over here. That's where that production manager role comes from. And I always thought it was worth taking a moment or two to talk through, because not only is it a role, but it gives you an idea about how they expect us to use some of this stuff. The name of that alone indicates the concept that that's going to be a role responsible for importing into a protected project. So I just like walking that through with you to give you the complete picture of security. I know I jumped ahead a bit, I'll go back, but hopefully that clarifies at least security a little bit. There's your suite, the component level, and then each tool does it differently. Each InfoSphere product has a different sub-level. So for Information Analyzer, they have totally different roles than for DataStage, for example. So for us, it's InfoSphere Suite, DataStage user or admin, and then which of these roles am I assigned if I am a DataStage user. So I snuck ahead here because I just wanted to, I always felt that reads a little bit better if you can take that as one complete thought, rather than jumping over to the next thing, which is the engine credential. I thought about this over lunch and kind of preparing for my lecture after lunch here and thinking about what we'd be discussing. And I realized I probably should have pointed out earlier that for those of you who aren't familiar, DataStage was originally a standalone product. And so that's where a lot of these odd interplays pop up between DataStage and WebSphere, and they can each run independently, but I need access to both of them these days to run a job. So years ago, way back when, DataStage was a standalone product. And as now you may see it a little bit more clearly, there are still a few points where you can recognize certain growing pains that were caused by that. Hence, the engine living outside of WebSphere being a complete own entity, but yet controlled by the WebSphere process, things like that discussion we had earlier. Another clear example of where you can see that is here. The idea of the DataStage credential is one where you can truly see that parts of DataStage still tends to think it's a standalone product. Even though it's not, it's now part of that domain concept we talked about earlier. It turns out that the DataStage engine, when it runs a job, because it is the engine that's responsible for launching the job, is going to be the one tied to the processes. So what does that mean for us? It means that given this setup, when we create the JSON account and we mark me as a developer on DS project, so we say, okay, Jason's a DS user. For DS project, I am a developer, which means I should be allowed to run jobs. So I create that file to DB job we talked about in that example I drew. On the server, where the project actually resides, there is a job called file to DB. We discussed this a little bit earlier, that when I try to launch that job, I'm running it on Ed server. On the actual server machine is where it's going to run. Here's where it gets a little bit odd, and you can see DataStage showing that concept again, that it seems to think it's standalone. I am logged into InfoSphere as Jason. When I attempt to run file to DB job, Ed server is going to say, who's trying to run that process? Because Ed server wants to make sure that whoever tries to execute this has the appropriate permissions to do so, meaning at the very least, they have to have access to the execute bit. So when the JSON account from InfoSphere tries to launch this job, Ed server is going to say, I have no idea who that is, and it's going to shut me down. That's where the idea of the engine credential comes in. We have to somehow provide credentials for this guy, for the DataStage engine on the server, so that when it tries to launch file to DB, the Ed server machine will allow those processes to get created. And there's a couple of different ways we can do it. There's actually 3 options. The first and most commonly used is what they're showing you here. The default account that gets created when you install InfoSphere is called DSADM. So we can actually go in and say, you know what? Let's set up a default account, DSADM. we're going to provide the DataStage engine with an account called DSADM that does have full access to that directory, which means when JSON in InfoSphere attempts to run a job, InfoSphere will record that JSON ran a job at 2:35. But if you look at the Ed server system logs, you're going to see that at 2:35, DSADM ran a bunch of processes. So the first option is to just create one default account that we all use. And the only downside to that is if you try to use logs on the server side, native server logs, not InfoSphere logs, but native server logs, you're going to see processes that are tied to DSADM. That's actually not uncommon. If you look at tools on your system, a lot of times look at DB2, for example, and its processes are owned by DB2I and ST1. Or you go into Windows and things are owned by the administrator account. So it's not a terribly uncommon concept to say, I'm going to create a default account. All the processes that are running over here from DataStage will be tied to that. But the InfoSphere logs would record that JSON asked to run this at 1:35. So we have an audit trail that can track who actually ran the job. It's just that it's inside of InfoSphere. And again, that's what most people are going to do. 9 out of 10 times, that's the solution. Give it one default account and be done with it. What if you said to me, well, I understand the logic, however, we can't do it that way. We have a policy that says we must be able to track on the server the person who ran the job, the process. In other words, any processes started on Ed server must be tied to the actual account that launched them. If that's the case, then we have to somehow make the JSON account from InfoSphere match up to some account that Ed server will recognize. And so there's two ways to do that. So the other two options are, you could create accounts on Ed server. We log on to Ed server, we create a new account called J. So J is an account on Ed server that does have execute rights in the directory where the DataStage engine is installed. Then you can go into the web console, the console that you're seeing here. And in the InfoSphere web console, you can actually say the InfoSphere account JSON. So InfoSphere account JSON is mapped to the server account for J. And what that means is when I log into InfoSphere and I try to run that job, the server will record that J ran it. The downside to that is you have to create one account per user, and then somebody has to go build all those maps. And as you can imagine, if you've got a couple hundred developers in there, it can get really time-consuming to keep up with that. So if you really need each user from InfoSphere to be tracked individually against their account on the server, what most people do is they go with the third option. On the screen here, there's an option that says share user registry between InfoSphere information server and its engine right here. So the option that says share user registry between the InfoSphere information server and its engine means we create a scenario where InfoSphere and Ed server are using the same set of credentials. And realistically, the only way to do that is to use LDAP. So what we do, intrinsically, by itself, out of the box, InfoSphere records its accounts in the XMeta repository. So by default, every time you create a new InfoSphere account, you're updating the metadata repository. You can configure the WebSphere portion of this, since that's the piece responsible for access control, to use LDAP. So we configure InfoSphere to use LDAP. And then you configure the server itself to also use LDAP. Which means when I create an InfoSphere account for JSON, that account is also eligible to the server, especially if I then say, when you create the JSON account in LDAP, make him part of the group Ed server, or whatever we call that group. So we're designing a system where the server and InfoSphere are using the exact same set of credentials. Now I go ahead, I log into DataStage as JSON, I run the file to DB as JSON, and the server records that JSON ran it, because it's just the same account in both cases. So one way or another, we have to give the Ed server an account with permissions to run processes on that box. And you can do it with a default, you can do it with a one-by-one map, or you could set InfoSphere and the server to use the same set of credential management. That's why most people just go with the default and then track the audit via InfoSphere.
If you've used like LDAP, then you'd have to create a group like that has permission to run processes on the box, right? Because that's going to be a server machine. Most places aren't just going to go, oh yeah, you can be admin on that server, right?
Correct. That's exactly right, John. So if we do it exactly as I described it, and Jason's in that group, we create a group called Ed Server. Ed Server has to have execute permissions to the directory where this was installed, because otherwise it won't work. It's not enough. I think the point you're driving at, which is absolutely right, is it's not enough to just be recognized. It's got to be an account that the server says, I recognize you, and you have the execute bit turned on for where this thing lives.
Out of curiosity, would you say that's relatively common? Like when we do analytics, like take Cognos, it always accesses as itself, like as a service account, right? And right. Then it knows, Cognos' log knows who ran what, but the database normally kind of only sees Cognos.
Correct.
Right? And that's security in the app.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut. Yeah, I was just going to say that, and that's exactly what we do 99% of the time in InfoSphere. It's not worth all this extra configuration. We'll just do, what they have on the screen there. DSADM will be responsible for the processes in DataStage, and we'll trust the InfoSphere audit logs for who actually ran the job. Exactly as you just.
Because a lot of times the AD admin guys will go mental if individual users have the ability to run processes on a machine, right? Because how do they know I'm just running DataStage? If I can execute processes on the machine, then they don't know I'm just running DataStage, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the once or twice when I've had, a server admin who said, well, we need to know who's running what. We can't just have a generic account. Once I explained to them that, okay, every DataStage user has an account that theoretically they can log on to the server with, they usually go back to, okay, we can just use the default account. Because as you said, they're going to lose their minds if you're giving 200 people accounts that can run processes, let alone log in to their servers. So yeah, you're 100% right. Just like Cognos, just like WebSphere does the same thing, DB2 does the same thing. We tend to create one process-based account. And the reason they're using DSADM, that's the default install account. So you know that one's going to work because it's the account that by default owns that whole directory. So you're absolutely right. And just so everyone caught what John said, the reason that we're okay with relaxing that and saying let it just be one default account is because the logs in InfoSphere will absolutely show you that it was the JSON account who ran the job at the time they shouldn't have, or that ran a job that failed. It's not like we can suddenly hide it. We're just saying that to get those logs, you'd have to go to InfoSphere. They're not going to be at the server level. And that's fine. That's what most tools are designed to do anyway. So just want to make sure we're clear on that point. Okay, this is the login to the DataStage Administrator. I know I showed you a little bit of this earlier. What I would particularly point out here is notice the two different servers. It's what we were talking about earlier. I want to log into the DataStage admin client, and I have to tell it the WebSphere server at server 9443 and the machine where the DataStage engine lives. Now, in our case, they're both on the same box, so they're both Ed server. But that's what I was pointing out earlier, that for everything we do, we need both processes. I need to tie to WebSphere and to the DataStage engine. When you log into the DataStage admin, we can select a project or create a new one. I was saying earlier, they have a very nice logical process where we really go through each step, as you'll see in the labs here relatively shortly, as if it was a brand new setup. The only place where they where we cheated on that a little bit. They've created the project for us already. So the only step we're not doing in the labs that you would have to do in the real world is create your project. But honestly, they haven't put anything in there yet. There's nothing preset. They did it so that they could set a few environment variables for us so we wouldn't have to go hunting them all down. It's just a step they did for convenience for us. So DS project, as you see it here, that's exactly what we're going to see when we log in. DS project exists, but we're going to set the properties. So we select the project, we go into properties, and something that I found that sometimes catches folks off guard coming from other tools, DataStage will let an average user log into the DataStage Administrator client. So if I'm just a developer in a project, I can log in and pull this up. It's very much restricted as to what I can do in here, but they do let a general user come in here. And so I've had the question repeatedly, why does it allow that? And my answer has always been, best guess is that they want us to have access to the environment variables. Because as a user who probably can't change those, I want to see what they're set to. So it allows me to see how are we handling environment variables. It allows me to see things like how long are we keeping logs for. I very well may not be able to edit those, but it allows me to understand certain important pieces of our project setup. So for better or worse, and you'll see this in the lab, your users can access the admin client. They just are very restricted as to what they can do. As an actual admin, there's a lot you can do. And it starts primarily with the environment variables. So the first thing you'd usually want to do is click that button they're highlighting here, environment, and it pulls up a list of variables. The first one they've highlighted is what I mentioned earlier, that if we said by default our jobs run on 6 nodes, but we're building a project that's going to need much more processing because they're much bigger record sets, then we could change the default right here. We could say for this project, the config file should be, and we could give it a different path. So there are settings, and we're going to keep bumping up against these settings as we go along. We'll see various stages where I'll mention environment variables that you may want to alter to change the way the system runs. But the first and foremost of those is the config file. What configuration file do you want to use for your project? There is a whole nother set of these under parallel reporting that people tend to change with regard to whether you're in development or production. If you go to the subsection parallel reporting, there are options here as to what you want to see in the logs. Excuse me. And so what you can do here is decide how much detail do you want in the log. As a rule, DataStage is very log stingy. As a rule, DataStage says, I'm going to do my best to try to log very low amounts of data. Because when you're processing 6 million rows, 6 billion rows, 6 trillion rows, every little piece of data that you create for a record can start to become exponentially large and start taking up a lot of space on the server. So we tend to be pretty stingy in how much detail DataStage wants to log. However, in development, we may want to log more detail because it makes it easier to debug our jobs while we're designing them. So they give you some very good examples here. The 2 things that I would always turn on in development are APT dump score and OSH dump. To explain those a little bit, and we're going to see a lot more on those tomorrow, when you design a job in the GUI, at runtime it becomes an orchestrate shell script. So what we design in those nice, neat pictograms becomes a piece of runtime code called a shell script, an orchestrate shell script. And so by saying OSH dump, you're asking the system to print the script to the logs so that we can actually see the script that it translated into. That script and the configuration file come together to produce something called the score. The score is an actual audit trail of exactly how the job ran at runtime. It's the true audit trail of exactly what happened. And we're gonna look at the score so that you can get a feel for exactly what it tells you. But to give you the quick rundown on it, the score is your single best point of access for trying to assess performance, for trying to assess efficiency, to look for optimization points. So that score is extremely important when you're designing to make sure that we've built things in the most logical and efficient manner. Hence, dump score and show me the OSH are two things that I do want in the logs during development. There's a few others there that I would usually turn on that they didn't call out. And to be fair, they are more personal choices. I like in development to see process IDs, record counts, and startup status. So there's three other settings there that I usually tend to enable that they are leaving as turned off here. That would be show me process IDs, show me record counts, and they do have startup status and they're turned on. What those do, just give you a little rundown. Process IDs, the PIDs of the server. And they do that in case I ever build a bad job, or you could accidentally build an infinite loop or something of that effect. If something went horribly wrong, I like to know that all else fails, I could go to the server and kill the process ID. There are ways that you can go into DataStage, like in the director, and say stop the job. But I do like to know that if all else fails, I can track the PID on the server in case we really have a problem and I have to go kill it that way. So I just like, for development, having the process IDs available. Tell you the truth, I've never found that to be a terrible idea in production either. It's not a lot of data you're asking for, and it just helps me sleep better at night to know that I can kill a data stage process without having to kill the server because the PIDs are in the logs. So you might want to consider that one just in general. The other ones, record counts, I would never want in production, but in dev, it's nice to see. It's a good way to confirm that it's working. I know 1,000 rows should have gone in and 50 rows should have been rejected. Having those record counts print out in the logs makes it easier to confirm that. And then startup status. What that does, it gives you a little extra message on each stage's initiation. How did that stage run? So it helps me identify if there was a problem, where was the problem in the design. This stage started okay, this one started okay, no startup message from that stage. Something went wrong between points A and B. And that's something that could get heavy in production. I wouldn't want that turned on for production, but in dev, it makes life easier. So just to remind you, the ones I mentioned that aren't called out here, APT PM show PIDs, APT record counts, and APT startup status. There is a page in the Knowledge Center that lists every environment variable for a parallel job with a little description about it. And it's one of the links I put in the list of resources for you guys. That way, if you ever wanted to go through, especially the reporting ones, and just see what the other options were, you have a reference for it. The prompts aren't bad either. The prompt gives you a few details, but the Knowledge Center is a little bit more complete. It gives you a more complete description of what those choices entail. So I just thought I'd point a couple of them out and make sure that I reference that you do have a list when the class is over of every variable that you may want to at some point utilize. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll keep referring back to these. You're going to see various variables as we go through. Certain jobs we tinker with, we might want to change or customize a few of these as we go along. Here's that permissions tab I showed you earlier. So we see the admins all show up on the project. Anyone who's not an admin has to be explicitly added. Typically, we do it by group, but in this case, we're adding a user. The user is DS user. Once added to the project, we simply assign them a role. And again, just to remind you, it's operator, can run jobs, but that's it. Can't open the designer. Super operator can run jobs and open the designer, but in read-only mode. Developer can design, can edit, can run, compile, and a production manager can do everything a developer can do, but can also import into a protected project. The logs tab allows me to specify if I want to auto purge, and it's a good idea to do so. The logs are stored inside of the metadata repository. So we don't want them eating up a lot of space. We can auto purge logs, and it's either by runs or by days. So I can say purge logs that are older than 10 days, older than 5 days, up to the last 2 runs. This is another one that in dev, I'm far stricter than in production. In production, I usually have to follow some form of policy. We might have a corporate policy that says I have to keep ETL logs or data management logs for the last 7 days immediately available. And then I might look at ways to try to archive older ones. But Point is, there are probably policies I'm already working with that I simply have to set my project to adhere to. The production version of the project, anything older than 10 days I can remove. Whereas in development, I just keep the last 2 runs worth of data so I get a smaller footprint. So you can specify by days or by runs how many logs you want to retain. They also show the parallel tab. And on this parallel tab, there's an option for generated OSH to be visible for parallel jobs in all projects. What that does is it tells the system that you want it to create a human legible form of the orchestrate shell script. So let's go ahead and take this guy down. I was mentioning this earlier about the OSH dump option in the logs. You create a job, and part of the beauty of DataStage is that it lets me create this job using these great GUI editors. So that when I create a job that's going to read data from a database, dedupe it, transform it, and sort it, and then store it on a sequential file. It would look simply like this. Read it from the database. Let's do a sort. And in that sort, I'm going to tell it to keep only unique values. I send it on to a transformer. And then from a transformer to a sequential file. So when we build the jobs inside of the designer, we're just adding these items from a palette to our canvas. At runtime, obviously, it's got to become some kind of machine code. So at runtime, when it gets compiled, this turns into your orchestrate shell script, or OSH. Now, that orchestrate shell script, by default, is being written not for us, it's being written for the DataStage engine to interpret. Which is as it should be. Most of the time, we don't want to see the OSH. But in development, you might want to see the OSH. So checking the box here on the parallel tab, the option that says generated OSH visible. When you check that box, what you're saying is, before you go ahead and create OSH to send on to the engine, that DataStage engine we keep drawing, create a copy of that that is text-based, that is human legible, then create the executable version that you're going to send on. See what I mean? If I don't ask it to, it won't bother with this step. It says, why bother? It's an extra step you don't need because the OSH is meant for the engine, not for you. So it's something that you may choose to turn on, as I mentioned, in development. And so you have to check this box, generated OSH visible, in order to have the OSH get created. Which means back here, when we showed you the environment variable for OSH dump, it's not the whole story. If you say OSH dump true, but you never check that other box, you're not going to get anything. Because here you're telling it to dump the OSH to the logs. But if we're not creating the OSH, this will say I'll dump it, but there's nothing to dump. It's going to be dumping an empty buffer. So it's really a two-part process. If you want to see the orchestrate shell script in the logs, OSH dump true, and then check the box you see here. Just to play devil's advocate on that, if I didn't check, or rather, I'm sorry, if I checked the box but didn't enable the OSH dump in the logs, what does it do? It causes the OSH to be visible in the job properties. It is nice. If you check that option, generated OSH visible, in the job properties for any job, it will show you the orchestrate shell script as it's being designed, as it's developing. So by checking that box, you can see OSH in the job properties. By checking that box and then enabling the environment variable, you'll see the OSH in the logs as well. We'll talk more about OSH. I'm going to teach you how to read the OSH tomorrow. I will tell you that, for what it's worth, I don't put a lot of stock in the OSH. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just, in my opinion, the OSH isn't giving me anything that I didn't already know. Whereas the score, which is the runtime audit trail, gives me information that I won't find anywhere else. So I'll leave it at that. I ask you to take that comment on faith for the moment. When I have examples of each in front of me, I'll come back and make that statement again, and we can see exactly what I meant by that. But for what it's worth, there are many people, myself included, who don't even bother to view the OSH. To be fair, there are some folks who love it. So it's one of those things that it either resonates with you or it doesn't. But there's a chance that you might decide you don't want the OSH at all, and you're just going to work with the score. They have a couple points here. Authorization can be assigned to what two items? It's misleading because they go very basic to start with. They mean users and groups. And it's misleading because you think it's the second question. Which two types of authorizations can we assign? And that's InfoSphere Suite and then components. And that's what we spend a lot of time talking about, that inside of InfoSphere you have, who are you to the InfoSphere Suite? Which components are you given access to? So as they mentioned in their last 2 points, in addition to InfoSphere Suite authorization, to log into DataStage, what else does a DataStage developer require? They need to be granted access to the DataStage component. And they just asked the same question a few different ways. Suppose that a DS user is assigned a DataStage user role. What permission do they need to build jobs? They would need to then be a DataStage developer or production manager. So just remember the 3 tiers. What are you to InfoSphere Suite? What are you to the components? And then if we're talking about DataStage, what role am I assigned? Am I a DataStage admin or a user? And if I'm a user, I'm either an operator, a super operator, a developer, or production manager. So there's the 3 tiers of security we have to deal with in terms of DataStage particularly. One last note, and then I'll let you guys show you how to try this stuff out on your own. They don't mention it, and I don't think you can see it on the screenshot here. Yeah, it cuts off just a little bit. But allow me to just briefly demonstrate one quick point, if I may, and then I'll get out of your way here. So this is my lab system, and as I said, in a moment here, I'll show you all how to connect to your labs. But I just wanted to show you that if I go in, let me open up my web browser. Now, you'll all have to do the same thing. We're using self-signed servers, obviously. So when we first log in, you'll get a message like this. I'm sure you've all seen them before. We're going to say, I understand the risk. We're going to add the exception and confirm it. This is that Launchpad page we talked about. This is a static HTML page that just has links on it to the URL-based tools, the thin client tools. I'm going to open up the administration console, and you're all going to try this out on your own here relatively soon. I'm going to log in and create a new account. Users and groups, users. All the way over here on the far right is the new user option. The username, the account will be Jason. The password will be Jason as well. First name, Jason. Last name, O'Connor. Now, what I wanted to show you is that here I set up the role of an InfoSphere Suite user. The component, DataStage, and Quality Stage user. When I'm done, I'm going to save and close. So at the very bottom there, I could save it and keep it open or save and close. You always want to save and close in their web tool, unless you're planning on continuing working on that page, because otherwise you get a lot of these pages stacked up, a lot of tabs, and it gets very hard to work through. So let me save and close. On the other side, I'm going to open the DataStage Administration client using a DataStage admin account. So student is actually a DataStage administrator. And I'm going to add Jason to a project. So here we see the existing projects, DS project. Go to properties, permissions. So far, because it's a brand new project, only administrators are showing. So I'm going to add, here's my missing account, add me to the project, set me up as a developer. And done. Now, the reason I did that, what I wanted to show you that was missing from the slides, in my humble opinion, is that back over here, when I pull up the account in the InfoSphere admin, it is smart enough to show you all three tiers. So that even though that last level, assigning me to that project, had to be done via the DataStage Administration console, the InfoSphere admin tool can still show me all three tiers of security. So I open up the Jason account, and what I can see here is that I am to InfoSphere, I am an InfoSphere Suite user. Let's minimize that. To the components, I'm a DataStage and QualityStage user. And then there's a third level that says, what projects am I associated with? And this is what I was saying. I can't edit this, but it does bubble up. And that InfoSphere gives me one place to go to see everything about that account, which I always thought was a nice option. It means that I don't have to go digging into 2 different or 3 different tools to figure out just what permissions has this account been granted. So true, I can't edit this, but it does show me that as far as projects are concerned, I have been granted a project role of DataStage and QualityStage developer. So you're able to see all 3 tiers of access from a single point of access in the IS admin. Okay, I just wanted to mention that because it wasn't mentioned in the notes. That being said, let me show you how to access the labs, and then you're on your own for a little bit. I'm sure you're happy enough for a break of listening to me prattle on. Here, we'll give you guys a chance to try some of this stuff out.